The story of the Topeka Insane Asylum and the wider world of American asylums is one of shadows, silence, and suffering that stretches back across generations. In the heart of Kansas, the Topeka State Hospital, once referred to as the Topeka Insane Asylum, was opened in the late 19th century with the promise of being a sanctuary for those afflicted with mental illness, a place where treatment and compassion would replace stigma and neglect. Instead, it became one of many institutions across the United States that would leave behind a legacy of horror, cruelty, and secrecy. To understand the darkness of the Topeka Asylum, one must first understand the climate of the times, the beliefs surrounding mental illness, and the way institutions that were supposed to protect became prisons of torment. The Topeka State Hospital was built in 1872, during a period when the United States was embracing large institutions as the answer to social problems. The public viewed mental illness not as a medical condition but as something to be hidden away, something shameful that families often wanted removed from the home and placed behind locked doors. The asylum movement grew out of a belief that the mentally ill could be cured through structure, hard work, and isolation from the outside world. Patients were sent away, often against their will, and told they would recover in the quiet and regimented life of the asylum. The reality, however, was far more sinister. The overcrowding, the lack of medical understanding, the absence of oversight, and the unchecked authority of staff led to environments where neglect and abuse flourished. The Topeka Insane Asylum became one such place, a facility whose very name now evokes a sense of dread. Life inside the walls of Topeka was grim. Many patients were not even mentally ill in the modern sense but were committed for reasons ranging from depression, epilepsy, alcoholism, or simply for being inconvenient to their families. Women, in particular, could be institutionalized for refusing to conform to social expectations, disobeying husbands, or showing signs of postpartum depression. Once inside, patients often found that leaving was not an option. The stigma of mental illness, combined with the lack of patient rights, meant that those admitted could remain confined indefinitely. For many, the asylum became a life sentence, not a place of healing. Stories of abuse within Topeka's walls are numerous. Patients were subjected to treatments that today seem barbaric and inhumane. Restraints were commonly used, from straitjackets to shackles, not as a means of safety but as tools of control. Solitary confinement was widespread, with individuals left alone for days, sometimes weeks, in dark and empty rooms. Electroconvulsive therapy, then in its crude infancy, was administered without anesthesia, leaving patients convulsing violently in agony. Hydrotherapy was another common practice, where patients were immersed in scalding hot or freezing cold baths for hours on end, supposedly to calm their nerves but more often leaving them traumatized and physically harmed. Staff shortages meant that care was minimal, and with overcrowding, many patients languished in filth, neglected and forgotten. Perhaps the most disturbing allegations surrounding Topeka involve the sterilizations that took place under Kansas's eugenics laws. In the early 20th century, the eugenics movement gained traction in America, promoting the idea that society could improve itself by preventing the mentally ill, the disabled, and the undesirable from reproducing. Kansas was one of several states that passed laws allowing compulsory sterilization of asylum patients. At Topeka, thousands of individuals, many of them women, were sterilized. Against their will. Doctors justified this under the guise of science, claiming they were preventing the spread of mental illness to future generations. In reality, it was a gross violation of human rights, leaving countless individuals mutilated, traumatized, and robbed of their ability to have families. The sterilizations at Topeka are a chilling reminder of how pseudoscience and prejudice combined to create one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. The architecture of the asylum itself also contributed to its aura of terror. The sprawling grounds of the Topeka State Hospital contained long, narrow hallways, locked wards, and towering buildings that seemed designed more for containment than care. Patients lived in overcrowded dormitories, with little privacy or comfort. The grounds were dotted with graveyards, rows of unmarked graves where the forgotten dead were buried, their names lost to history. Walking those grounds today, one can still feel the weight of sorrow lingering in the soil, a reminder of the countless lives that ended behind those walls without recognition or dignity. Topeka was far from unique in its horrors. Across America, asylums became dumping grounds for society's unwanted, and the stories that emerged from them echo a pattern of neglect and abuse. At institutions like Willowbrook in New York, Penhurst in Pennsylvania, and Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, the conditions were hauntingly similar. Overcrowding turned hallways into sleeping quarters, where patients lay on bare floors in their own filth. Staff, overwhelmed and undertrained, turned to brutality and indifference as survival mechanisms. Experimental treatments, such as lobotomies, became commonplace, leaving patients permanently damaged in the name of progress. The horrors of Topeka were part of a larger system of suffering that spanned the country. In Kansas, the abuses at Topeka became public in the mid-20th century, as journalists and investigators began to uncover the truth. Reports surfaced of patients being beaten, starved, and restrained for days. Whistleblowers described wards filled with screaming, neglected individuals, and yet, for years, the horrors were ignored by the wider public. Families often did not want to know what was happening to their relatives, and politicians preferred to look away rather than confront the failures of the mental health system. The veil of secrecy surrounding the asylum remained in place until the late 20th century, when reform movements finally began to dismantle the old system. The closure of the Topeka State Hospital in 1997 marked the end of an era, but not the end of the suffering. Former patients and their families have continued to share stories of trauma, abuse, and neglect. Survivors speak of the lifelong scars left by their experiences, from the physical injuries of forced treatments to the emotional wounds of isolation and humiliation. Many never received justice or recognition for what they endured. The legacy of Topeka and institutions like it remains one of pain and silence, a reminder of how easily systems meant to heal can become instruments of cruelty. The story of Topeka also reflects broader questions about how societies treat their most vulnerable. The asylum movement began with good intentions, driven by reformers who believed that mental illness required specialized care. Yet without oversight, resources, or compassion, these institutions became places of horror. The history of Topeka is not just about one asylum, but about the failures of a system that valued order and control over humanity. It is a lesson that continues to resonate today, as debates over mental health care and institutionalization remain ongoing. The ghosts of Topeka remind us that the line between care and cruelty is thin, and that vigilance is required to ensure the mistakes of the past are not repeated. Even in its abandonment, the Topeka State Hospital has maintained a chilling reputation. Paranormal investigators and urban explorers who have visited the site report strange occurrences, from unexplained sounds to eerie sensations. The stories of hauntings are fueled by the asylum's dark past, with many believing that the restless spirits of the forgotten patients still wander its grounds. The idea that the suffering of so many could leave an imprint on the physical space is not hard to believe, given the weight of history carried within those walls. Whether or not one believes in ghosts, the haunted reputation of Topeka serves as a metaphor for the way its horrors continue to linger in the American consciousness. The dark secrets of Topeka Insane Asylum and other American asylums are often buried under layers of denial and forgetfulness, but they demand to be remembered. They serve as stark warnings about the dangers of unchecked power, the consequences of dehumanization, and the importance of compassion in the care of the vulnerable. The voices of the patients, though silenced in life, speak through the records, the testimonies, and the memories that remain. They remind us that behind every locked door, every experiment, every unmarked grave, there was a human being whose dignity deserved to be preserved. The horror of Topeka is not just history, it is a mirror held up to society, asking whether we have truly learned from our past or whether such darkness could return in new forms. As the ruins of asylums like Topeka crumble, the stories must not be allowed to fade. They are chapters in a book written in suffering, but also in resilience. Some patients survived, some families fought for change, and reformers eventually succeeded in closing many of these institutions. Their efforts brought about new understandings of mental illness, new treatments, and new rights for patients. Yet the scars of the asylum era remain etched into the landscape of America's medical history. The tale of Topeka is one of betrayal and horror, but it is also one that underscores the necessity of empathy, oversight, and respect for human life. In the end, the Topeka Insane Asylum stands as both a physical and symbolic monument to the failures of a system that promised healing but delivered suffering. Its halls echo with the cries of those who were silenced, its grounds conceal the bones of the forgotten, and its legacy challenges us to confront the darkest corners of our history. The horror of Topeka is not just in the past, it is a warning carved into memory, reminding us that the treatment of the vulnerable is a measure of a society's humanity. Only by acknowledging the darkness can we hope to ensure that such horrors never repeat, and that the shadows of places like Topeka finally give way to light. 1. Origins of the Topeka Insane Asylum. The Topeka Insane Asylum, later known as Topeka State Hospital, opened in 1872 with the supposed goal of providing care for the mentally ill. Its founders claimed it would be a sanctuary, a place of treatment rather than punishment. However, like many institutions of its era, Topeka quickly became a dumping ground for society's unwanted. The grand promises of healing were overshadowed by overcrowding, underfunding, and neglect. Instead of being a beacon of medical progress, Topeka grew infamous as a place where countless people lived out their days in silence, stripped of dignity and forgotten by the outside world. 2. The 19th century attitude toward mental illness. In the late 1800s, mental illness was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized. Rather than seeing it as a medical issue, society viewed it as a form of weakness, a morality, or a family disgrace. Families often felt pressure to hide mentally ill relatives, leading to widespread institutionalization. Asylums like Topeka were built not primarily for healing but for removing these individuals from public view. Once inside, patients had little say over their fate. They were treated more as burdens than human beings. This cultural climate created fertile ground for abuse, as the public rarely questioned what happened behind asylum walls. 3. Who was sent to asylums? Patients at Topeka were not always mentally ill in ways we would recognize today. Some suffered from conditions like depression or epilepsy, while others were alcoholics or simply considered difficult. Troublingly, many were sent there for reasons unrelated to mental health at all. A husband could have his wife committed if she defied him, or a family might send away an unruly teenager. Poverty, disability, or even being an orphan could be enough to warrant admission. The criteria were vague, and once admitted, leaving was almost impossible. This meant Topeka became home to countless individuals who should never have been confined. 4. Women and institutionalization. Women were especially vulnerable to wrongful institutionalization. In a time when gender roles were rigid, women who resisted domestic expectations risked being labeled unstable. A wife refusing her husband's authority could find herself locked away indefinitely. Women experiencing postpartum depression or mood swings were often accused of hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis that justified long-term confinement. Many were subjected to treatments without consent, their bodies and minds controlled by male doctors and administrators. At Topeka, countless women lost their freedom not because of mental illness but because they dared to step outside society's narrow view of female behavior. 5. Life behind the walls. Daily life inside the asylum was grim. Overcrowding meant patients often lived in unsanitary, cramped dormitories. Basic medical care was scarce, and hygiene was neglected. Food was often meager, and malnutrition was common. Many patients spent their days in enforced idleness, locked in rooms or pacing hallways. The institution promised treatment, but in reality, it offered little more than containment. For those who entered, life was reduced to monotony, silence, and submission. Families rarely visited, and many patients became forgotten shadows, living and dying in obscurity. The supposed refuge became a prison where dignity and humanity slowly eroded away. 6. Use of restraints. One of the most disturbing aspects of Topeka was the routine use of restraints. Straitjackets, chains, and shackles were employed not just to prevent self-harm but to punish and control. Patients considered unruly or resistant were tied down for hours or even days. These restraints caused physical injuries, sores, and long-term trauma. Solitary confinement was another common practice, with patients locked in barren rooms as a form of discipline. The use of restraints reflected the asylum's true purpose, not healing, but control. Patients were treated as problems to be managed, their suffering compounded by cruel and unnecessary physical domination. 7. Primitive treatments. Treatments at Topeka often inflicted more harm than healing. Electroconvulsive therapy was administered without anesthesia, causing patients to convulse violently in agony. Hydrotherapy involved forcing patients into scalding hot or ice-cold baths for hours, leaving them shocked and traumatized. Solitary isolation was considered therapeutic, though it frequently broke patients' spirits. In some cases, experimental drugs and early psychosurgeries were attempted with devastating results. These methods were justified as modern science, but in truth, they reflected desperation and ignorance. Rather than curing patients, these brutal treatments deepened their suffering, making recovery nearly impossible and cementing Topeka's reputation as a place of horror. 8. Overcrowding and neglect. By the mid-20th century, Topeka was severely overcrowded. Designed to hold hundreds, it often housed thousands. This made individualized care impossible. Patients were crammed into wards where they slept on floors, sometimes surrounded by filth. Staff, overwhelmed and undertrained, could not provide proper attention, leading to widespread neglect. Infections spread easily, and many patients died of preventable illnesses. Neglect often proved as harmful as deliberate abuse. With resources stretched thin and oversight lacking, Topeka became a warehouse for human suffering. The combination of overcrowding and apathy made life inside unbearable for those unlucky enough to be confined there. 9. The rise of eugenics in Kansas. In the early 20th century, Kansas embraced the eugenics movement, which promoted sterilization of the unfit to prevent them from reproducing. Topeka became a key site for this practice. Legislators and doctors argued that sterilization would improve society, but in reality, it was a tool of control and oppression. Mental illness, disability, poverty, and even defiance of social norms could mark someone for sterilization. Kansas passed laws that gave institutions like Topeka the legal authority to permanently alter patients' bodies without consent. What was presented as science was in fact a horrific violation of human rights on a massive scale. 10. The horror of sterilization. At Topeka, thousands of sterilizations were performed, many on women who had no say in the matter. Patients were told little or nothing about what was being done to them. Some believed they were undergoing routine surgeries, only to later discover they had been robbed of the ability to have children. These sterilizations left deep psychological scars, compounding the trauma of institutionalization. For women, especially, it was an assault on both body and identity. The legacy of this practice remains one of the darkest stains on Topeka's history, a reminder of how easily science can be twisted into cruelty. 11. The architecture of fear. The very design of Topeka contributed to its chilling reputation. Its looming buildings, long corridors, and locked wards gave the asylum a prison-like atmosphere. Patients lived in dormitories with little privacy, surrounded by cold stone walls and barred windows. The architecture emphasized containment over comfort. Visitors often described the facility as intimidating, with an air of dread that hung over its grounds. Even in daylight, the halls felt oppressive, and at night, the silence was broken only by distant cries. The physical environment mirrored the hopelessness of life inside, making the asylum a place of both physical and psychological imprisonment. 12. The graveyards of Topeka. Scattered across the grounds of the asylum were graveyards filled with unmarked graves. Patients who died often had no family to claim them, and the institution buried them in anonymity. Their names and stories were lost, reduced to numbers in records. The graveyards became silent testaments to forgotten lives. Walking among them, one is struck by the sheer scale of loss, rows upon rows of people erased from memory. These cemeteries highlight the dehumanization of patients, whose deaths were treated with as little dignity as their lives. The ground itself became a monument to the countless souls consumed by neglect. 13. Shared patterns with other asylums. The horrors of Topeka were not isolated. Across America, asylums followed similar patterns of neglect, overcrowding, and abuse. At Pennhurst in Pennsylvania, children with disabilities were left naked and starving. At Willowbrook in New York, patients were confined in filth and subjected to unethical medical experiments. Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts became infamous for its role in lobotomies. These institutions, like Topeka, promised care but delivered suffering. The repetition of these horrors across the country reveals that the problem was not with individual hospitals but with the asylum system itself, a system that valued containment over compassion. 14. Reports of abuse. Over the years, whistleblowers and journalists exposed shocking stories from inside Topeka. Patients were beaten by staff, denied food, and restrained for days without cause. Investigations revealed wards filled with screaming, neglected individuals. Yet these reports were often buried or dismissed. The asylum maintained a veil of secrecy, aided by public indifference. Only persistent exposure in the mid-20th century forced officials to acknowledge the horrors. Even then, change was slow, and many patients continued to suffer long after the truth came to light. These reports highlight how silence and secrecy allowed abuse to thrive unchecked for decades. 15. Public indifference. Part of what allowed Topeka's horrors to persist was public indifference. Families often preferred not to ask questions about what happened to their relatives inside. Society as a whole turned a blind eye, treating patients as outcasts unworthy of concern. Politicians avoided addressing the issue, fearing controversy or expense. This culture of denial shielded the institution from scrutiny. The suffering of thousands was hidden behind walls, out of sight and out of mind. The failure of the public to demand accountability reflects a broader societal failure, a willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable for the comfort of ignorance. 16. Closure of Topeka State Hospital. After more than a century of operation, Topeka State Hospital finally closed in 1997. Its closure marked the end of an era but did not erase its legacy. By the late 20th century, changing views on mental health and the rise of community-based care had made massive asylums obsolete. But for the thousands who lived and died there, the closure came too late. The empty buildings stood as silent witnesses to decades of suffering. While some celebrated the end of institutionalization, others were left grappling with the scars of what had happened behind Topeka's locked doors. 17. Survivors, voices. In the years since its closure, survivors have come forward with stories of trauma. They describe beatings, forced treatments, and humiliations that left deep scars. Many speak of the emotional wounds, feelings of abandonment, fear, and powerlessness that persisted long after release. Some never fully recovered, haunted by memories of confinement. For those sterilized, the loss of reproductive freedom became a lifelong pain. These voices are vital, ensuring that the suffering is not forgotten. They remind the world that the patients were not statistics but individuals whose lives were permanently altered by the cruelty of the asylum system. 18. Haunted reputation. Today, Topeka's remains are often described as haunted. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators report strange sounds, cold spots, and the sense of being watched. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the stories reflect the deep impression left by so much suffering. The idea that the pain of thousands could leave an imprint on the place feels almost natural. The haunted reputation has turned Topeka into a symbol, not just of the supernatural, but of history's refusal to be buried. Its ghost stories echo the real ghosts of its past, the men and women whose cries once filled its halls. 19. The broader lesson. The story of Topeka carries lessons far beyond one institution. It shows how good intentions can warp into cruelty when unchecked power, ignorance, and stigma dominate. The asylum movement began with reformers seeking care but ended with widespread abuse. This history warns of the dangers of forgetting compassion, of prioritizing control over humanity. Even today, mental health care faces challenges of underfunding, stigma, and neglect. The legacy of Topeka serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us that the vulnerable must be protected, their dignity respected, and their rights safeguarded against systems that can so easily turn oppressive. 20. The warning of history. Ultimately, the Topeka Insane Asylum stands as a warning etched into history. Its walls may have crumbled, but its legacy persists as a reminder of how society once treated its most vulnerable. The horrors that occurred there, neglect, abuse, sterilization, dehumanization, must never be repeated. Remembering Topeka is not about dwelling in darkness but about ensuring vigilance. The way a society treats the marginalized is a measure of its humanity. The warning of Topeka is clear: forget the lessons of history, and the horrors of the past can return in new forms. Memory is the only true safeguard against repetition.